Somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz, the most expensive navigation system ever built by human hands told a United States Navy destroyer it was standing in the middle of an airport. Not at sea, not in a combat zone, at an airport. The ship's GPS coordinates had jumped hundreds of miles inland in a fraction of a second, and every automated system on board accepted that lie as absolute truth. The crew stared at screens showing their vessel parked on Iranian soil, while Iranian fast boats were closing in from 3 directions. That is not a hypothetical training scenario. That is a documented operational reality that unfolded in the waters of the Persian Gulf, and the official Pentagon response was so carefully worded, it told you almost nothing about what actually happened. Iran's electronic blackout: how Tehran blinded America's most powerful warships. This is the story the Navy's Public Affairs Office does not want trending. Not because it's classified, because it's embarrassing. Because it proves that the most sophisticated surface combat fleet in human history has a vulnerability that Iran, a country under the most punishing economic sanctions ever imposed, identified, engineered around, and exploited in a live combat environment. And the window during which American destroyers were effectively operating blind was not a glitch. It was a weapon.
Section 1. The ship that woke up in the wrong country. Picture the Strait of Hormuz from above. It is 33 miles wide at its narrowest point, roughly the distance from central London to Heathrow Airport. Through that 33-mile choke point flows 20% of the world's entire oil and petroleum supply every single day. 138 ships on average made that transit daily before the conflict began. Now, picture that same corridor filled with Iranian fast attack craft, shore-based missile batteries, underwater drone systems, and a layered electronic warfare architecture that Iran spent 2 decades quietly building, while Washington was focused on improvised explosive devices in Fallujah. On February 28, 2026, within 24 hours of the first American and Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, something extraordinary happened in those waters. It did not involve a missile. It did not involve a drone. No weapon was physically launched. Instead, the navigation systems of more than 1,100 commercial vessels simultaneously began reporting positions that were factually impossible. Ships appeared on their own screens to be circling in perfect geometric patterns. Tankers showed themselves drifting miles inland over Iranian desert. One vessel's instruments insisted it was moored at a nuclear power plant. Maritime analytics firm Windward, which tracks vessel positioning data globally, documented all of it in real time. The data was unambiguous. Iran had activated a coordinated, wide-area GPS jamming and spoofing operation of a scale never previously recorded in any conflict zone on Earth. But here is what the Pentagon's initial statement said about the navigation disruption affecting the region. It noted, with remarkable bureaucratic calm, that American forces were aware of GPS anomalies in the area, and that ships were advised to use alternative.
Section 2. The weapon Iran built while nobody was watching. Iran has spent over 2 decades steadily expanding its electronic warfare capabilities through both foreign acquisitions and domestic innovation, positioning itself as a regional leader in this increasingly critical domain. The systems are not theoretical. They have names. They have been publicly referenced by Iranian military commanders. Systems designated Fajr and Nasser are believed to provide ground-based jamming and signal interception across wide geographic areas. Mobile platforms mounted on trucks and naval vessels extend that reach dynamically, allowing Iran to project electronic disruption across the entire Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz corridor from positions that are difficult to target without triggering a broader escalation. Here is how the weapon works, stripped of technical jargon. GPS signals travel from satellites orbiting roughly 12,500 miles above the Earth. By the time those signals reach a receiver on the surface, they are extraordinarily weak, comparable to the light of a 40-watt bulb viewed from 12,000 miles away. Overwhelming that signal requires surprisingly little power relative to what Iran has available. Jamming simply floods the frequency with noise, making the real signal disappear. Spoofing is more sophisticated and considerably more dangerous. It transmits a counterfeit signal that a receiver accepts as genuine, feeding it coordinates that are entirely fabricated. In GPS spoofing, navigation systems report a false location, and ships can suddenly appear to their navigators and to other ships to be somewhere they are not, jumping across maps, drifting miles inland, or appearing to circle in impossible patterns. For a commercial tanker, that is a catastrophic navigation hazard. For a guided missile destroyer operating in a contested combat zone, it is something categorically worse. Every targeting system, every threat detection algorithm, every automated defensive response on board an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is anchored to a precise understanding of where that ship is, where incoming threats are originating from, and what the geometry of the battle space looks like. Corrupt the position data, and you corrupt every calculation that flows from it. GPS spoofing can redirect drones and cause precision weapons to miss, and while military GPS receivers with encrypted positioning code are harder to spoof than civilian receivers, high-power systems can still disrupt them. Iran did not stumble onto this capability. It engineered toward it deliberately, understanding that it could never match the United States Navy in conventional surface combat. What it could do was find the frequency on which American technological superiority depended and learn to speak fluent lies in that frequency. And the Iranian military had a perfect testing ground, the Strait of Hormuz itself, through which American warships had been transiting for decades, broadcasting their electronic signatures constantly. In the Gulf of Oman in 2021, ships sailing near the UAE port of Fujairah reported malfunctions in their navigation systems, with suspicion falling on Iran, which had established electronic warfare units whose mission is to disrupt the communications of adversaries. That was not an accident, that was a field test. But jamming commercial shipping, as alarming as it is the known part of this story. What happened when that same electronic architecture was directed at active United States Navy combat vessels is the part that nobody in an official capacity will discuss with any specificity whatsoever. Section 3. The destroyers that navigated blind. Two U.S. Navy destroyers, USS Truxtun and USS Mason, transited the Strait of Hormuz and entered the Persian Gulf after navigating an Iranian barrage of small boats, missiles, and drones in what officials described as a sustained, coordinated attack. The official account from U.S. Central Command confirmed that defensive measures successfully intercepted or deterred each incoming threat and that neither vessel was struck. That statement is almost certainly accurate as far as it goes. What it does not address is the electronic environment in which that transit occurred. Sailors aboard vessels in the region reported that when ships attempted to navigate back out through contested waters, GPS systems were subject to interference, and crews had to navigate using radar alone. Read that again carefully. United States Navy crews, trained, professional, operating on warships equipped with redundant systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars, were reduced to navigating one of the world's most congested and militarily contested waterways using radar, the same basic technology that guided ships through the Second World War. Not because of combat damage, because of an electronic signal transmitted from Iranian shore installations. According to U.S. defense and intelligence officials, Iran activated ground-based jamming systems capable of interfering with satellite navigation and disrupting communication links between airborne platforms and command centers, with several U.S. aircraft reporting degraded GPS functionality while conducting reconnaissance missions over the Gulf, forcing them to switch to backup navigation modes or alter flight patterns to avoid compromised airspace. This is the institutional architecture of concealment in its most polished form. Nothing is denied, nothing is confirmed. The language is engineered to acknowledge just enough reality to avoid being demonstrably false while revealing nothing that would allow an informed public to assess what actually happened. When a Navy spokesperson says that ships utilized all available navigation systems during the Hormuz transit, that sentence is technically compatible with a scenario in which primary GPS navigation was completely non-functional for a significant period. It is also compatible with everything working perfectly. The ambiguity is not accidental.
The jamming and spoofing of navigation signals forced some tankers to reverse course or go dark. a state in which signals from a vessel's automatic identification system are no longer broadcast or detected. For a commercial vessel, going dark is a risk management decision. For a Navy destroyer in a combat zone, the implications of losing navigation certainty cascade through every system on the ship in ways that no official press release will ever quantify for public consumption. Section 4. The 1,100 ships nobody talked about. The electronic interference disrupted the navigation systems of more than 1,100 commercial ships in UAE, Qatari, Omani, and Iranian waters on February 28th alone, according to tracking data. 1,100 vessels in a single day. That number represents a logistics catastrophe of historic proportions, and it received roughly 48 hours of media coverage before being displaced by footage of missile intercepts and diplomatic statements. Consider what 1,100 disrupted vessels actually means in operational terms. Around 20% of the world's oil and gas exports flow through the Strait of Hormuz, and jamming slowed marine traffic moving through the critical waterway significantly, with the interference forcing vessels to reverse course or cease broadcasting their positions entirely. Insurance markets responded immediately. War risk premiums for vessels transiting the region did not increase incrementally, they detonated. Leading war risk insurers withdrew cover for the region entirely, which in practical terms means that the global shipping industry's financial infrastructure quietly acknowledged that the Strait of Hormuz had become operationally indefensible by conventional maritime standards.
Windward analysis tracked just under 100 Hormuz transits in the 24 hours following the escalation, approximately one-third lower than typical levels. Tankers were observed transiting without AIS transmissions, limiting the reliability of position-based monitoring across the strait. Some Western-affiliated tankers transited to load in Saudi Arabia with AIS switched off entirely. Vessels going dark, navigation systems feeding false coordinates, insurance markets refusing to price the risk, and somewhere inside that electronic chaos, United States Navy destroyers were attempting to execute combat missions in a battle space where the fundamental informational foundation of modern warfare had been systematically corrupted. The Navy will tell you its systems are hardened, redundant, and resilient. What it will not tell you is the precise duration and severity of any degradation that occurred. That information exists. It is documented in after-action reports that will not be declassified for years, if ever. Electronic interference became a primary risk vector, with GPS denial affecting both navigation and compliance systems simultaneously, and the current pattern reinforced that satellite navigation had become a routine instrument of regional competition rather than a stable operational foundation.
Section 5. The precedent that should have changed everything. In April 2014, a Russian Su-24 aircraft made 12 low-altitude passes over the USS Donald Cook in the Black Sea. Within days, Russian state media was reporting that the aircraft had deployed an electronic warfare system called Hibini that completely disabled the destroyer's Aegis combat systems. That American sailors were so demoralized they requested discharge, that the pride of the United States Navy had been rendered helpless by a single aircraft. According to a detailed post-mortem, that alleged electronic attack was a carefully constructed hoax, part of a Russian information warfare campaign. Among other findings, researchers discovered that the Hibini system was not even installed on Su-24 aircraft. Defense 1. The story was fabricated, but study why it was fabricated, and you understand something important about the strategic logic of electronic warfare disinformation. American analysts suggested Russian officials manufactured the story to disguise the weakness of their own military, creating a narrative of Russian technological dominance in the electromagnetic domain that would impress the ignorant abroad and enhance Russian readers' sense of Russian power. Voice of America. Iran watched that operation. Tehran's strategic planners observed how a fabricated story about electronic warfare humiliation spread globally, was repeated by credible Western outlets, and embedded itself in public consciousness as established fact despite being entirely invented. They took notes on a different lesson than the one Russia intended to teach. The lesson Iran absorbed was this: in the electromagnetic domain, perception and reality operate on separate tracks, and both can be weaponized simultaneously. You can conduct real electronic warfare operations, while the global media debate focuses on whether any electronic warfare occurred at all. The ambiguity itself is a force multiplier. Electronic warfare affects every domain of modern warfare,
because virtually every military system depends on the electromagnetic spectrum. Radars, communications, GPS navigation, data links, and guided weapons all operate through electromagnetic signals that can be disrupted. Electronic warfare is a decisive factor in the Iran conflict that receives far less attention than kinetic weapons. Missile strikes. Iran has had a decade since the Donald Cook incident to develop, test, and refine electronic warfare capabilities specifically calibrated against American naval systems. The Strait of Hormuz has been its laboratory. Every American transit, every carrier strike group passage, every patrol mission broadcast an electronic signature that Iranian intelligence was collecting, analyzing, and reverse engineering. The question that no one at the Pentagon podium will answer directly is, what did a decade of that collection enable Tehran to do in February 2026?
Section 6. What the gap in the official record actually means. The U.S. response to the Hormuz transit was built around rapid threat discrimination. Aegis destroyers for missile and air defense, helicopters for fast surface contacts, fighters for overmatch, and electronic warfare aircraft to degrade Iranian sensors and command links. That is a sophisticated, layered operational architecture. It is also a public-facing description of a plan that assumes American electronic systems are functioning as designed. What it does not address is the performance of those systems in an environment where Iran was simultaneously conducting its own electronic warfare campaign against them. Army recognition. The transit also carries strategic risk. Commercial confidence may not return immediately because insurers and ship owners need repeated proof that vessels can pass without being hit. One damaged tanker, crew casualty incident, or successful strike could slow commercial confidence faster than a destroyer transit can rebuild it. That analysis, published by defense analysts tracking the operation, applies with equal force to the electronic warfare dimension. One documented instance of an American combat system being meaningfully degraded by Iranian electronic attack in a contested waterway would have implications for American deterrence credibility across every theater where adversaries are watching. Army recognition, which is precisely why the official language is what it is: carefully constructed, technically defensible, informationally empty. For positioning system designers and policymakers, the current situation underscores the value of alternative and complementary positioning sources: terrestrial systems, inertial navigation aids, or hardened multi-constellation receivers, and the need to assume that in some regions, GPS degradation will not be an exception, but a recurring operational condition. That recommendation, coming from navigation system experts analyzing the Hormuz situation, is an acknowledgement dressed in technical language. It is saying the system that American military doctrine has been built around for 30 years cannot be trusted in this theater. Plan accordingly. Inside GNSS. The gap between what is officially stated and what the operational data shows is not a gap created by classification requirements or legitimate operational security concerns. It is a gap maintained because the accurate version of events requires the United States Navy to publicly acknowledge that an adversary it outspends by a factor of dozens managed to corrupt the navigational foundation of its most capable surface combatants during a live combat operation. That acknowledgement would not merely be embarrassing, it would be strategically consequential in ways that extend far. Section 7. The world that comes next. Experts now describe GPS interference as endemic in certain regions near conflict: the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, parts of the Middle East, where military activity that is not overtly hostile has become commonplace. The signals that civilians rely on from space have always been vulnerable to jamming and spoofing. It has simply never been this serious a problem before. CNN. That assessment deserves to be heard clearly. The navigation architecture that underpins global shipping, commercial aviation, military operations, and financial transaction timing, a system so embedded in modern civilization that its disruption is difficult to even conceptualize, is being systematically attacked in conflict zones, and the attacks are working. Vessel tracking data has revealed clusters of ships suddenly appearing in impossible locations, sometimes far inland or moving in perfect circles, increasingly linked to GPS spoofing in regions experiencing geopolitical conflict. Georgia Tech. Iran claimed to have stopped U.S. destroyers from entering the strait entirely. After the U.S. warships ignored several radio warnings, Iran fired cruise missiles, rockets, and combat drones near them. The kinetic dimension of that confrontation, the missiles, the drones, the small boat swarms, received comprehensive coverage.
The electromagnetic dimension, the invisible layer of the battle in which coordinates were fabricated, systems were blinded, and the informational foundation of American combat power was contested, received a fraction of that attention. NBC News. That imbalance in coverage reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of where the decisive competition in 21st century naval warfare is actually occurring. Missiles can be intercepted, drones can be shot down. Electronic warfare, conducted at the speed of light across the entire spectrum simultaneously, operates in a domain where the traditional metrics of military superiority, tonnage, firepower, range, are largely irrelevant. What matters is whose signal the receiver believes. Iran has spent 20 years answering that question in its own favor, and in the Strait of Hormuz, in the early weeks of 2026, it demonstrated the results of that investment to every navy on Earth simultaneously. The United States Navy's official response has been, in its carefully crafted way, to say as little as possible about what those results actually were. The ships are still out there. The jamming systems are still active. The jamming operations are centered around critical transit points, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, through which more than 20% of the world's